Hi, I'm Gary Lowell, president of Lowell Boats and an accredited marine surveyor with SAMS. In my company, we do antique wooden boat restorations of power and sailboats and a little bit of everything. And I thought I would show you some techniques that I use for inspecting wooden boats. When we get boats into our shop for restoration, all of them need some type of initial inspection to figure out what's wrong with them. So we get pretty familiar with all types of construction. Let me show you some of the tools that we're going to use first. And you can use just about anything you're used to using, but what has worked well for me is just a regular slotted screwdriver. A lot of times you will hear people say that they'll use an ice pick to poke around on boats, but usually that's too sharp, and even on a brand new piece of white cedar or something real thin, you know, the ice pick is going to go right through anyway and not show you if there's any rot. So I like just a regular slotted screwdriver. You can use it with the grain or against the grain. You can use it to pry in and remove certain pieces, or if you have a frame, you can pry between the two pieces and check for the tightness of the fasteners. You can also use a hammer as you're sounding your wooden project, but I find that just the heel of the screwdriver gives me a good tone, and I can also feel it a little better. So you can hear the difference. So you can hear the hollow pieces and actually feel them better, I think, with the end of the screwdriver. As you are working on your project, you're going to need to remove yourself, or have removed, all of the interior pieces of the boat. And I know a lot of times as surveyors, we don't get the opportunity to get in there and remove everything. So you really need to make sure that if you're not going to remove it, you've got to have somebody else remove it. And that is all of the floorboards, the engine box, anything that's in the way, so you can get a good look at the bilge. You're not going to be able to find all the problems that you need just by looking up underneath the floorboards. You've got to have them removed. And one fastener that you're going to need to be aware of, if you're not already, normally we have our slotted screwdriver and we have a Phillips screwdriver, but in wooden boats, most of them are fastened with bronze fasteners. And the screws on bronze fasteners, if they look like a Phillips, they're not a true Phillips. It's called a Frierson. It's a little hard to say, Frierson, or sometimes called a Reed and Prince. And that is a screwdriver that looks similar to a Phillips, but the Phillips screwdriver won't fit all the way down in, and it's hard to get them to, it'll strip the bronze out. So make sure that you have a slotted, a Phillips, and a Frierson screwdriver bit. I just have a bit that I use in my drill, and I can put it in, and if you have to remove a fastener and you uncover it and you find out that it looks like a Phillips screwdriver, it's bronze, it's probably a Frierson rather than Phillips. So I just need you to know the difference. And here's a graphic that shows you the very minute difference between a Frierson and a Phillips. Okay, and those are your screwdriver choices. And of course, you're going to need a flashlight. This is a pretty bright LED light, but no matter how bright it is, you're always going to need one brighter. So when you're buying a light, get the very brightest you can find. Okay? Now, let's talk about types of hull construction. The ones that we see the most are plank and batten, or plank and batten with a double planked bottom. Then you have lap strake, or sometimes called clinker construction. You have cold molded construction, and even strip planked. Let's take a look at some plank and batten construction. Okay? This on the outside looks very similar to carvel plank, where the edges of the planks are butted together. However, they're butted so tightly that there's no caulk inside. They are secured with bronze screws through the cut frames, and between each plank a real thin batten is attached, and then you can see all these bung holes here. That's meets on this very thin batten to help hold it together. It's a really nice, easy construction method. It's rather delicate. These are maybe 9mm or 3/8 of an inch thick. So it's a fairly decent lake boat, but I wouldn't take it offshore just because of the thinness of the construction. As you're looking at these, one thing to look at is, and naturally you'll have to look at this from the inside, do the fasteners break through the batten, and has the batten been split? Another problem with these is that the tops of the battens will trap water and dirt, and that will cause rot from the inside. Okay? So this boat has a plank and batten outside, a top side above the chine, but below the chine, right here, is a double planked bottom. This one has already been planked with an inner layer of plywood and an outer layer of solid mahogany, and then it's been faired and painted. Between the two layers, we put in 3M 5200 adhesive. It's a very strong joint. Originally, they used cotton muslin fabric inside there with a troweled on seam compound, and that held up for a couple of years, but over time that has washed away and the cotton has rotted, so there's really not much left to the original bottoms. Some builders have chosen to use epoxy between the two layers, which we found over time, you know, will work for a couple of years, but after 10, 15 years, things are going to start to crack and fail. So that's why the common practice is to use 5200 flexible adhesive between the two layers. And you can see on this boat, when the 5200 is cured, it's a very strong bottom. But I've got another boat over here that we are repairing, and we have the bottom off, and you can see a little bit better what goes into a double planked bottom. Now originally, before say the mid-1950s, the inner planking was actually mahogany, solid mahogany lumber, diagonally laid, and it was very thin, probably about 3 or 4 millimeters or about 3/16 of an inch. And they would lay that at a diagonal, and then the outer planking would be fore and aft, and then glued together and fastened. What we're doing now, or what most people are doing as the restoration process, is that inner layer is being replaced with BS 1088 plywood, and then on top of that we've got the fore and aft mahogany, and between the layers is where the 5200 goes, and then these are fastened down and screwed to the existing frames and structure, and intermediate frames are put in to help squeeze everything together and make it cured. So as you're looking at the construction, if you look from the inside, you can almost tell better what the construction looks like and how well it held up than the outside, because the outside is usually solid lumber. So if you see diagonal planking inside with lots of little screws holding it together, then you can pretty much assume that that's an original bottom, and it's going to need replacement fairly soon. Now let's look at cold molded boats. Now, cold molding is a term that we use nowadays, but back in the 50s and 60s, the boats were actually put together with a glue and then put in an oven, so it was truly a hot molded boat. but because we don't need to put them in the oven to warm them up, they're called cold molded. And that type of construction is where a frame mold is made, and then individual veneers of wood are laid over in crisscross pattern to build up the structure. And you can see here's an example of real thin mahogany. It has 7 layers, and it's been curved over a mold, and it's really only about 90 millimeters thick. So it's very strong and lightweight. However, it's very difficult to repair. The good thing is that each layer has a glue in it which helps slow down the progression of mold and rot through the boat. But once you've got that in there, you pretty much have to repair it as a cold molded boat, which means it has to be cut out and each individual layer relaminated back in place. Most of those damaged places are going to happen right along the keel or right along the transom to keel joint right in the back where fresh water is going to settle. So if you're surveying a cold molded boat, keep in mind that the repair costs are going to be more due to the complexity of the repair. So let's go look at some clinker construction or lapstrake. And here we have a Chris-Craft sea skiff, which is constructed with the clinker method. Each plank is plywood, and you can see that the joints are overlapped and then fastened. There are steam bent ribs on the inside, and the planks are fastened with screws or bolts, depending on the builder, to the frames. And then between the frames, each lap is fastened with either a clinch nail, a rivet, sometimes little tiny nuts and bolts. So there are various different types of fasteners for those. Okay, here we are inside of the sea skiff, and you can see the frames are steam bent oak, and they travel, most of them travel all the way through the hull as one piece. Some of them naturally under the prop and the strut come together and end at the keel, but most of them are full length, so it's a very strong construction. The outer planks are screwed to the frames, and you can see the rivets or clench nails are bent over on the frames here, and that's what gives you your seal. Over time, those little bronze clinch nails are going to work and can loosen. Some of the boats were originally glued together, and some were used a resorcinol glue, or even later on a polyurethane glue like 5200, and that's a really good strong bond. However, with time, everything is going to work and expand, and it can fail. And that's where, over time, these fasteners, depending on how they're maintained, will lose strength or even completely corrode away if they're kept in salt water. So you've got to be careful to look at each joint, and that's where this slotted screwdriver comes in handy. These are all nice and tight. Okay, let's look at frame and where rot is usually going to happen. These floor timbers right here are just some little stringers that are going to hold up the floorboards. As freshwater rain hits this and runs off, it usually lands right here. So you've got to remove these floorboards so you can get in and see what you're looking at. And this area, right at the turn of the bilge, is where rot seems to happen quite a bit. Not only in the planks, but in the frames as well. And you can see I'm going to tap through here. The frames sound good. I'm not finding any soft areas here, but on the back side, where you can get some breakage against that, that one's a little suspect. And here we go. Look at that. See that black? Even though it's got fresh paint on it, that is hiding some rot. So you need to make a note of that. On the outside, it sounds nice and solid, but when I'm poking around inside, I'm finding little bits of rot. So that's where, and you can see on this frame here, the split continues all the way down. So I didn't find any on this frame, but the next one will need to be replaced. As I'm doing a survey inside, I will actually number each frame, starting with number 1 at the very front and work my way back. So right here we're at about frame number 35, 36, 37, and then 38 will need to be replaced. Since it runs all the way through to the boat, the starboard side might be okay, but it doesn't really matter since the port side is bad and it has to go back in as one continuous piece. That means this whole frame has to be replaced if it's to be replaced properly. It is possible to recommend a repair of a scarf or a sister. Again, structurally, there's nothing wrong with a sister or a scarf. That's a fairly decent repair method, but if you're keeping originality, you want to make sure that it's completely removed and completely replaced. Okay, let's look a little bit further. That one looks pretty good. This hull joint here between the frames, the planks, and this transom, this is another place where junk builds up and water will gather. So you want to make sure you get in here. Fortunately, we have the fuel tank removed so you can see, but with the fuel tank in there, it's going to be real hard to get in there. So you're going to have to make sure you have a good strong light or even a borescope where you can reach in and double check. While you're here, make sure you check the stuffing box, not only for the stuffing box gland, but also the bolts holding the stuffing box in. They tend to work themselves loose, and you can reach in there with your hand and they'll be finger loose, and that's something that ought to be addressed. So make sure you look at all of the linkage to the steering and the rudder and the strut and everything as you're looking through the aft end of the boat. Now, let's go do the same inspection of a 1940 barrelback runabout. Well, hi. I am down in the bilge of a 1940 barrelback. We have all of the systems removed, the fuel tank, the engine, all of the exhaust, and that way you can see the construction that I talked about earlier. We have the cut frames, the sawn frames that run all the way around. We've got the bottom frames that come along to a gusset where they're bolted to a vertical frame, or futtock, as some people call it. We've got the fore and aft stringers, the battens that are laid into the frames, and that's what the planks are fastened to along here. And you can see that these frames, these little battens are solid. They're not split. I don't see rot. Along this chine is another place to look. You can see right here it's angled in, so water and leaves and junk can collect here, and this area is prone to rot. So check these chines all the way along here. Check the fasteners. A lot of these bolts will work loose. Those should be tight. Here we have the full-length sawn frames. Here we have the smaller intermediate frames that help hold the inner and the outer layers of the planking together. This is a butt block for one of the outer planks. You want to check to make sure that this isn't split or rotted, or a lot of times it will work loose from the bottom. So check that and check all of those butt blocks. On the top of the butt block, you want to make sure nothing is gathered here. You want to be sure that all of the water is able to run through. If you look back here along the keel, we have the keel joined to the transom, and then it comes along the transom beam where it meets the side chine. On that chine you see a little angled knee joint. This is another tricky place to get to, but it's also very important. This will loosen up, spread apart, break, or rot. And right underneath here, this is part of something in the construction. You can see where there's a little space underneath there where leaves and dirt and junk can gather and hold moisture, causing rot. So see if you can get underneath here with some kind of long poker and make sure that that is clean and not rotted. Okay, well, you can see with all of the systems removed, we have quite an advantage to get at everything. So just keep in mind that when you don't have that luxury of having an open boat, you're going to have to figure out how you can get to the bilge. A borescope, bright lights, mirrors, whatever it takes, a big long poker. Long screwdriver is really great for reaching way in the back and pounding. A lot of the rot and problems you're not going to find from the outside. You have to double check from the inside. So if you don't have someone that's really small that can creep down into the bilge, you have to make adjustments for that. Also make sure that all the limber holes between the frames along the keel are free, because that's another place where rot will happen if you don't keep those limber holes clean. It's a nice boat. We're inside the back of a Chris Craft runabout to show you the running gear. And this is the rudder post that I was talking about earlier. You need to make sure that there's a stop lock on the top so the rudder can't fall out. Right here you have your stuffing box with your packing nut. You need to make sure that those are tight. And a lot of times these mounting bolts are what will work loose. So if you can move the rudder side to side at all, that indicates a problem. Also make sure that your rudder linkage is free of obstruction. This nut comes awfully close to this frame. It just barely clears it, but that's not, that's not ideal. So that ought to be addressed. Let's look at these nuts here. These are loose by hand, and that's not good. Sometimes I'll see that this structural member going across that helps tie in the strut and distribute the force to the engine stringers is down in the bilge and fairly dirty and nasty, and this will rot quite a bit. So if it looks like these washers have been sucked down into the rotted wood, that's not good, and that's going to not only propagate rot, but it's going to loosen that strut, and then you'll end up with a whole bunch of problems. Okay, we have come outside to a boat graveyard, and this is another old lapstrake boat. You can see some of the fasteners are showing. Obviously the deck needs replacement, but let's look at the hull. The planking sounds pretty good. The fastenings along the joint are nice and tight. Let's look down here at the keel. We've got some keel bolts that run through, and see this little triangle right here? That is the outer part of the gripe, and the gripe is a big, long, internal brace or a knee that connects the keel to the stem. And this joint, there is going to have large bolts. You can see the head of one bolt that goes through here. It looks like over time somebody has puttied this. And if you look along here, this is a big oak timber, and there's quite a bit of checking in it. Checking in oak is fairly common, so that's not necessarily a problem. I would definitely check it to make sure that there's no rot or splits. But if you look back a little bit further, well, there is a problem right there. That's another one of the through bolts that connects the gripe, and obviously that is a little bit suspect. You can see it actually looks worse than it is. That is fairly solid, fortunately, but this plug to cover that is pretty ugly. But again, in keels, large oak keels, you're going to see a lot of that checking. Some checking is to be expected and not necessarily fatal. If there are large checks that that you can put a screwdriver all the way through, then that's probably more than should be expected. Well, as you can see, there is a wide variety of hull construction and construction methods, types, ages. There's a lot to think about, but it's still just a boat on the water. So don't be afraid to survey a wooden boat. It's pretty much like every other boat. You've just got to watch out for your hull fasteners and watch out for rot, and those are the main things to look for. If you'd like some more information, the Coast Guard has prepared a circular called Guidance on Inspection, Repair, and Maintenance of Wooden Boat Hulls. It's NAVIC 7-95, and you can find that online through the Coast Guard. If you have any specific questions or want any info about a certain type of boat, please visit my website or send me an email at this address. Thank you very much.